Yes, hello everyone, and sorry for the technical trouble we suddenly have with Zoom. Welcome to this year's actually last webinar for Team Society, live from all the home offices in Trondheim and maybe other places as well. My name is Sarah Heidenreich. I'm a researcher working in Team Society, among other projects. And Team Society is one of the teams organized under NTNU Energy that deals with social science and humanities research on energy and sustainability issues. Today we have a presentation titled More Than Just a Game, How Being Creative Can Motivate Sustainable Change. And the speaker is Isabel Richter from the Department of Psychology. And we also have a discussant, Ivana Suboticki from the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies of Culture. And now I give the digital floor to Isabel.
Cool. Thank you so much for the introduction. And yeah, also from my side, sorry for all the confusion. I hope that some people can still join us after the link was updated. As Sarah already said, I'm presenting today about a lot of research that I have done in the last 2 or 3 years. And it's mainly around creative engagement and how it can spark sustainable change. And most of this research is taking place in the global south, which makes creative engagement particularly relevant because if we look at most of the publications from psychology and I guess from the social sciences in general, around 95% is with participants from the global north, that is who are well educated, who like speak English, who are easily accessible, where like this is also because in the global north there's the funding, we know like certain colleagues, and this is why most of the studies are conducted with these easy accessible participant groups. And I'm trying to bridge that a little bit and go towards less accessible participant groups, especially like from our point of view, and to see how sustainable change is seen in the global south. And I'm using creative methods to do that. So let's see how I can. There we go. I am a social and environmental psychologist. And for those who are not very familiar with environmental psychology, it's the connection between humans and nature, and it goes in both directions. So it means how we affect nature and how nature affects us. How should the environment be designed to increase our well-being, for example? And what kind of environments would potentially decrease our well-being? And also, on the other hand, how should we behave in order to increase the well-being of the environment, or at least not to decrease it? And how can we motivate change? And as psychologists, we are very much looking in this kind of decision-making, change-making process. And why am I interested in creative engagement? It is a way to involve people in the decision-making process through artistic experiences. And it's particularly useful with unusual participant groups because it creates a common language. People can decide themselves how they want to communicate. It can be adapted to the local ways of communication. Some people like to communicate with visuals. Some people like to communicate maybe more with their body language. And it's very inclusive and participatory. You can include for example, in coastal communities, there are lots of different players. There are the fishermen, there are the governmental, like the policymakers, there are the people from agriculture. And through this creative engagement, you can actually draw them all together and they can find a common ground and maybe even bridge some barriers in terms of gender and some other factors that might usually divide different groups. It also is an investment of time and effort, which leads to a certain level of commitment. If people spend a day creatively engaging with some form of sustainable topic, it creates a bit more commitment. And what I particularly like is that people come up with new solutions, they work together, they work towards a common goal. And this co-creation of solutions seems to be particularly powerful. And of course, it's also a lot of fun. What we don't know so much about yet is if it actually has measurable effects for sustainable development. So is it more than just fun, like the title is? Is it more than just a game? I mean, painting pictures about a sustainable future is great, but what does it actually do to our intentions and behavior? And I would like to present 6 studies to you that answer the following or try to answer the following research questions. What are the psychological and emotional effects that creative engagement create? Does it facilitate sustainable change? And if yes, what are the underlying processes between creative engagement and sustainable change? And what is there still to explore after we looked at those 6 studies? And the 6 studies, they are on a broad spectrum, from very exploratory to a bit less exploratory to one nice experimental design. So the first 2 studies that you see here, one from Indonesia and one from Norway, they are more exploratory, they are qualitative. And then we have 3 studies from the Philippines and from Vietnam which are quasi-experimental. And then there's one study from Malaysia that is a full experimental design. And I will talk you through all of them. And in between, I'll make a few breaks in order to kind of summarize. And so we can have a look what we found and draw things together in the end. So let's start with the first study. This one takes place in Indonesia. And the creative engagement in this one was making short films. The aim of the study was to get a first impression of what kind of processes are underlying creative engagement and sustainable change. Like, is there a connection between? And if yes, what might this connection be like? We recruited 21 young people from Selayar Island. Selayar Island is on the southern west tip of Sulawesi Island in Indonesia. It's very remote and it's a biosphere reserve. We had a few more females than males, and we divided them into 3 groups. In each of these 3 groups, they made a short film. So the whole engagement started with a workshop where they learned how to make short films. And these short films should be based on future scenarios, which were created by local stakeholders in the week before. So policymakers, fishermen, but not those young people. They were not involved in the scenario making process, but the scenarios were basically the ground on which they were supposed to make the movie, but they were still very free in deciding what kind of theme they wanted to look at. And one group was made a film around littering, one about alternative livelihoods, and one around water scarcity. And we employed a mixed method approach to evaluate this process. So we had quantitative surveys. However, with 21 participants, it's not like a sample where you can run statistical tests. It was more for descriptives. We had focus groups and we did a content analysis. So what did we find in the first experiment? If you look at the bottom right, there is this kind of creative engagement and the future scenarios on the one side and the sustainable change on the other side. And we found 3 major themes that happened somehow in between. And those themes were future thinking. So it seemed like this process increased the amount of how much people think about the future. People talked a lot about the future in the focus groups. The short films had a future dimension. And also one of the variables that we tested in the surveys was also around future dimension and how far or close the future feels. And it seemed like over this process, the future felt closer to the participants. Group processes and group cohesion seemed another big process that was mentioned quite a lot. So this kind of who is responsible, free riding versus cooperation, and that is for sustainability as a whole, but also for the filmmaking process. So it seemed like this kind of group cohesion and good or bad collaboration was a very important part. And interestingly, in one of the scenarios, the group did not collaborate well at all. And this group made a particularly bad short film. So in the other two groups, they made a really nice short film that made sense, that had a nice storyline. And this group, who did not collaborate very well and who complained a lot about other group members, this short film is actually like very confusing. And then the last big topic was the ascription of responsibility. Who is responsible, again, for making the movie, but also for sustainable topics, like is it the other community that is fishing all the fish, or is it us? And so responsibility was another big topic that was talked about quite a lot. So, and those three variables were also the three variables where we saw the biggest changes. Again, we are only looking at descriptives here, no significant testing, but future thinking, group cohesion, and ascription of responsibility showed a positive trend when we measured before and after. So that was the first study, and we can try to keep this in mind, that group cohesion, future thinking, and responsibility seem to be three themes that are important for sustainable change and creative engagement. And also emotions were mentioned quite a lot, so many answers were quite emotional. The next study comes from Norway, and it's from the Nature in Your Face project. Here, the workshop applied the Nature in Your Face methodology called framing, twisting, using, which means that you are reducing the question to an applicable frame. So instead of saying to the workshop participants, find a solution for climate change, you're kind of narrowing it down to what can you do to save electricity in your home, for example. In this case, we had 36 fifth grade pupils, again, a few more females than males. They were all from Kristiansand, and the topic was plastic pollution and its negative consequences. The creative engagement in this case was making collages and painting, and by doing this, trying to figure out a few solutions for the plastic problem within the frame that they were given. And during this process, a master student did some semi-structured interviews, and those were analyzed by content analysis. So which were the themes now that were identified? Similar to the other study from Indonesia, emotional reactions seem to be very predominant. So the students, they talked a lot about negative and positive emotions that they experienced. They were worried and frustrated about plastic pollution. In psychology, we might call this climate anxiety or eco-anxiety, what they were talking about. There was also a lot of positive emotions, mainly around the fun that they had, the group collaboration, and in psychology, we would maybe call this collective efficacy. Also, a future dimension was found quite often in the artworks that they made. So most of the artworks had a future dimension. Some were very gloomy, like a very pessimistic look into the future, but some were also very optimistic, almost like a utopian future with a very beautiful world, a lot of beach cleans and recycling, and some great solutions that they found. And another aspect was this cognitive dissonance around plastic as good and bad. And that's something that we have quite often in sustainability, that some interventions that are good for the climate might not be good for biodiversity. Some actions that might be good for our mental health might not be good for the environment. So it's very often that we have this kind of conflicting goals, and that creates a feeling of cognitive dissonance, because we don't really know what is the best to do, and we might act against our better knowledge. And it seemed like that was a very strong topic here as well. And the students said that they would like to find good solutions to cope with this cognitive dissonance. To summarize quickly the qualitative studies, so what did we find here? The three, I would say, major themes that were identified was a strong future thinking element. So the future seemed to be very important. The group processes seem to be very important. So almost no one seemed to say, well, I really like working on sustainability problems by myself. It seemed to be something that is best addressed in groups. Positive and negative emotions seem to play a big role. But then also the question of who is responsible. Am I individually, like, do I have the power to do something about the problem? Do we have the power to do something about the problem as a community? And this theme of cognitive dissonance and conflicting goals. So those, I would say, were the main themes that were identified in those qualitative studies. We can keep that in the back of our heads, and now we move on to the first, a bit less exploratory study. In this study, the question was, how should we create a visual so that it is effective? So often there are recommendations saying you should communicate to people with visuals because our human brain is wired to quickly assess visuals. We can understand it so much quicker, and it really kind of burns into our brains much better than text. But the question is, how can we create a good visual, especially for a broad audience? So what we did was that we created 29 visuals, and those visuals were created by a coastal community in Palawan around sustainability topics that were important to them. So we did not tell them what those visuals should be about, but we kind of helped them to create them. We gave them the facilities, the methods, the funding. So they were kind of free to create short videos or infographics, to take pictures, all the kind of visuals that they wanted to do, they were creating. And in the end, we had 29 of them. And then we did a quasi-experimental study on 2 samples. One sample was students and one sample was fisherfolk. And the way we did that was that we showed them each visual, and then they evaluated the visual first on the characteristics of the visual. Is it easy to understand? I can show the list actually. Is it easy to understand? Does it look professional? Is there novel content? Is it more positive or more negative? And then we ran a cluster analysis around that. I will show you in a bit how that looks like. And then we could see which visuals were very good, which visuals inspired people, and which visuals maybe did not inspire people, and how were they characterized. This is an example of one of the visuals that was made by the community. So, for example, chemicals are very easily accessible in the Philippines, but they are not restricted. So many of the chemicals that are used in farming are very dangerous for the skin or for the environment. So that is kind of one visual that took up this problem. Then in Palawan, there's also this problem that many of the young people are actually moving away from Palawan. So that one would kind of be one of the visuals that address this issue, that you can actually also have a career in Palawan. As I said, again, we did not steer them into any direction. So they were free in creating the visuals by themselves. And as researchers afterwards, we try to analyze the characteristics of them. So a cluster analysis works in the way that you have loads of different dimensions. So here on the slide, I can of course only show you a 2-dimensional space. So the horizontal and the vertical space, but actually there are more dimensions than this. And each of the visuals was placed somewhere in this dimensional space during our experimental assessment. And then you run the cluster analysis, you get a dendrogram, you make decisions, you decide for a number of clusters. And what you end up with is groups of visuals that have very similar characteristics. And in the first study with the students, we ended up with 5 clusters. In the study with the fisherfolk, we ended up with 3 clusters. And then you can give them names depending on their effects. And what we found was that the visuals that were particularly emotion evoking, they were very good. So they seemed to be very strong visuals. They had strong effects in terms of increasing behavioral intentions, making people more aware. People felt like they want to share this visual, or they want to talk about it, and they felt like this would change my behavior. Also, a clear behavioral message seemed to be very important. And interestingly, depending on the target group, different visuals seem to be effective or not. So the relevance of the particular visual for the particular target group is also very important, and a social dimension. Also quite interesting, the format did not make any difference. So creating a video is not necessarily more effective than creating a photograph or like an infographic. So we had, I think, 5 different formats of visuals, but this format did not play a role in making it more effective or less effective. What made it less effective, though, was if the visual was quite cluttered. So a little bit of a confusing design did not work for people. Giving a lot of information without a clear behavioral message did also not work. And if the visual did not tell anything new, if it was perceived as not novel and not having any behavioral message, then it was also not very effective. So to summarize, emotion evoking, behavioral message, relevance for the audience, and a social dimension seem to be very important to make a visual effective. When we go back to the qualitative studies and now kind of put on top the cluster analysis, it seems like solutions, emotions, and some kind of social dimension seem to reoccur here. In the cluster analysis, we did not find anything around cognitive dissonance or responsibility. So it seems like those 3 are at the moment the main processes between the creative engagement and the sustainable change. And next we will look at 2 studies where we tested this in a more experimental design. The first study is coming from the Philippines. And here we wanted to see how creative engagement, again, increases or decreases motivation and emotions. And we did that with a quasi-experimental design, which means we did not have a control group. We only had an experimental group. We had 109 students from Palawan. Again, that's in the Philippines. And we had 3 different experimental groups. Each of those groups were collaborating and making these murals that you see on the bottom of the picture. So they were painting these big pictures around sustainable change and sustainable futures. And the creative engagement was again based on future scenarios that were created by local stakeholders. So each group got 1 scenario narrative. One was positive, one was negative, and one was business as usual. And then they started painting around these stories. So this is the experimental design. We had a survey before and a survey after this creative engagement. And in between, we had 3 different groups of 3 different scenarios. And the creative engagement took around 2 hours. What did we find in this one? So we found that the intentions, like people can, in the survey, we had some variables that capture behavioral intentions, and those intentions increased. However, they only increased for the scenarios that were very positive or very negative, not for the business as usual one. So only the scenarios that potentially evoke more emotions seem to lead to quite a strong effect of increased intentions. All the scenarios led to a feeling that the future is closer and that we can actually influence the future with our actions today. And that's a novel finding because so far it was always assumed that the extent of how much we think we can influence the future is something that is stable across our life. So it's a personality trait. But in this study, we found a change. So if people actually actively engage with the future over a certain amount of time by being creative, then we can actually increase how much people think they can influence the future. And we also found an increased feeling of empowerment and positive emotions, again, for the emotional scenarios, not for the business as usual scenario. So it seems like the scenarios that evoke more emotions, they also lead to the feeling of empowerment. So that was and we mainly found that for positive emotions. Even for the negative, like for the worst case scenario, we found an increase for positive emotions. In the paper that we published, we discuss why we think that is, but yeah, that might be a wild guess. We have a similar study where we extended this design a little bit, and that comes from Vietnam. Again, we are trying to look at how creative engagement with those future scenarios might lead to sustainable change. This time we have more experimental groups. We again don't have a control group, but we have 3 times 3 experimental groups. So we have 3 different villages. In all 3 villages, we have 3 groups. So it's a slightly different design, a bit more like variety in it, but very similar to the study that I just discussed beforehand. And the experimental design that you see on the bottom right is also again very similar. We have a pre-survey, a post-survey after the engagement, and in between they engage with those future scenarios. In the case of Vietnam, they decided they would like to do some theater plays. So in Palawan, the people decided that they want to paint, and here they wanted to kind of act out the scenario. So they first wrote a little script, and then they acted out these scenarios. And again, it was an optimistic scenario, a pessimistic scenario, and a business as usual scenario. What did we find? So similar to Palawan, we found an increase in intentions. Again, only for the best and worst case scenario, not for the business as usual one. We also found that the future feels closer to participants. So again, this quite novel finding that how much do we feel we can influence the future, that seems to increase. And the positive emotions increase as well. A new finding is that anger and feeling scared increases in the business as usual group and decreases in the worst case scenario group. So we have some changes in the negative emotions here as well. And it really seems that the business as usual scenario is not a very good way of communicating because it even increases negative emotions. People felt like they know more about the future now. The future is less ambiguous. Maybe they feel like they have a bit more control, maybe because they collaborated with others. And another interesting finding is that, remember now our design is slightly different. We have 3 different villages. And if we look at the effects between those villages, it really made a difference where people collaborate. And that might be because maybe in some villages there is a better community and they can collaborate better. So this whole feeling of who is responsible for sustainability, like for sustainable change making, we had a completely changing picture of significant effects depending on the villages. So there is no clear picture if there's an increase or decrease. It really was depending on where people were collaborating. And I think that really shows that it depends on who are you collaborating with around sustainable change. Maybe it's people you can collaborate with well, and then it really works. But maybe it also doesn't work. And remember the example from Celaya around the video making. It also leads to quite bad output. If you have a group where you cannot collaborate well, what you produce in the end might really be bad quality. And that's kind of what we find here as well, that this kind of responsibility and group cohesion was all over the place, depending on where people were collaborating. And compared to the effects here with the intentions and the future and the positive emotions, those were clear effects that we found in every village and in every group. So that was quite interesting. Okay. Quick last summary before we head to the last experiment. So creative engagement and sustainable change, how are they connected now? So we can assume that somehow this feeling that the future is actually quite close, feeling that we can create solutions and having especially positive but also negative emotions. This might be some kind of moderator between creative engagement and intentions for sustainable change. It seems like this business as usual prospect is not a very good way of communicating, because what we found were negative effects compared to optimistic or pessimistic future prospects. And also group cohesion seems to be an important element. So people collaborating, collective efficacy, feeling that we are responsible for our local village, for example. So I'm not stating that these are that this is a perfect moderator design that we now have to test statistically, but I just try to visualize how this picture becomes maybe a bit more clear now that we kind of move on from study to study. And the last study is the only full experimental design that we have. And that one is around comic books in Malaysia. And here we want to see how if children read comic books and maybe color them in as well, how does this affect their own motivation, but also the motivation of their parents? And what is very interesting about this study is that the topic of this comic book is a very sensitive issue. It is dynamite fishing, and that is illegal in Malaysia, in Sabah. However, it is still done a lot. So it is a very, and of course people know in the village, in these coastal communities, that maybe their neighbor is doing it or maybe their grandfather is doing it. So it's kind of a sensitive issue. No one would admit that they are really doing it, but then it's happening still. And also because the villages and the communities are so small, if there is a police or a coast guard, they will probably be the friend of the one dynamite fishing, so it's not necessarily implemented. It's a very critical issue. So in this study, we are trying to look at this issue from a slightly different angle with this comic book. Because of COVID, the whole study has had to be changed. So in the beginning, the design was that we had one school on an island, one school on the mainland, and that one is the control group and one is the treatment group, and they wouldn't interact with each other. Unfortunately, the island school does not have internet, so we had to only use the mainland school and kind of divide them, but we could not really ensure that there was no interaction between those kids, of course. We had 120 children with their family members, more female children than male, and around 50% were directly depending on fishing for survival. The comic book was created by a local artist, and it's a kind of a nice story about dolphins who have been in this village in the past, but because of dynamite fishing, they left. And the grandfather is talking to his grandchild, and they are talking about solutions as well. We had a survey designed in a child-friendly way, and we translated and back-translated it to the local language as well. This is the study design. So we had a control group and a treatment group, and we had a before survey that was they filled out the first survey before anything happened. Then the treatment group got the comic book. Then we had another survey for both groups and another survey after 1 month. So one after 5 days, one after 1 month. And then the control children also got the comic book. So that's basically the design. We have a control group and treatment group, children and parents, and 3 time points. So what did we find? We found that there's an increase in behavioral intentions in the treatment group. And that was particularly strong after 1 month. So it seems like after 5 days, there was a tendency, and after 1 month, it was quite a strong change. So when maybe it took just some time to create these intentions and to read the comic book again or something like that. We also find intergenerational transfer, which is very exciting. So that means that we first find an increase in the children's intentions, and then after a while, we also find the increase in the parents' intentions, and that is only in the treatment group, not in the control group. So in the control group, there were no effects around those. So that is actually a really nice kind of perfect effect that we find here. However, this effect was only found for the items that were not very sensitive. So items such as, I want to talk about fish bombing with my friends and family. For those items, we find this effect. We find an increase for children, we find a later increase for parents, and it's all looking quite nicely. However, we also had items that were more sensitive. And then we also had to distinguish between people who directly depend on fishing and who do not depend on fishing. So what happens if we use items such as, I will never use bombs to fish again? So imagine you are a family, you are directly depending on fishing. Fishing gets more difficult over time because the fish grounds are empty. And you're sometimes using fish bombs because it's just very easy and cheap and you get a lot of fish. And then you fill out a survey and the item is, I will never use fish bombs again. Here we found a complete rejection. So that means a boomerang effect. That means that actually people got maybe a little bit angry about us asking those questions. And they said, well, of course I will use fish bombing in the future. So they actually indicated a strong rejection effect. However, this was only found for the people who directly depend on fishing and who did not get a comic book to engage. So what we can conclude from this is that this boomerang effect can be avoided if people have some kind of channel to engage, to have a dialogue about it, or to think about solutions, to read about solutions. And it really points towards how sensitive it can be to run these studies in communities who directly depend on those practices, even if they are not sustainable. So just asking about those things might actually create some resistance. But asking about it and providing some platform for dialogue and for creativity might maybe buffer this negative effect.
Isabel? Yeah, conclusions. Perfect. You used 40 minutes already. I just wanted to mention.
Yes, I'm on the finish line. Sorry. Yes, so under certain conditions, creative engagement can create sustainable change, especially when there are strong emotions involved. I find it quite interesting that this business as usual scenario seems to be like really not a good way to communicate. Solutions seem to lead to more empowerment, especially when those solutions are co-created, when you ask people to creatively work on solutions together. That also feeds into the next point. The collaboration and group seems to be very important. This feeling of being not alone, ownership for the solutions, and also how bad collaboration can actually lead to bad effects. And there's a potential buffer for these boomerang effects of how you can address sensitive topics when you provide a platform for dialogue or cognitive processing. Open questions for future research. I would like to point out that we did not assess actual behavior change. We had self-reported intentions or self-reported behavior. This is, of course, not the same as actual behavior change. It looks like collective creative processes are very powerful. We did not assess how it is like if I sit by myself and paint a picture about a sustainable future, does this do something as well? I assume it probably has an effect, but we don't know yet. Then this kind of the issue around the business as usual scenario, it's of course something that is communicated quite a lot by science. How does the future look like if we continue as we do? Where are we heading? How can we communicate this better without the negative side effects? And then just to kind of investigate more this kind of social cohesion and buffering effect, but that's probably a bit more in the psychology. I wanted to play a bit of the song that one of the groups made, but I'm not sure. Maybe we should prioritize questions and people can listen to the song with the YouTube link or something like that. I don't know.
Yes, I would suggest that we go right to Ivana's comments regarding the limited time we have.
Okay.
But thank you very much for a very rich and interesting presentation. And maybe we can play the song after Ivana's comments.
Oh.
We heard a bit now. So please, Ivana, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Isabel. I think it's a really interesting presentation, and I'm also very interested in the creative methods, which seem to be necessary in order to have a proper or fruitful co-design or co-production. So I come from this I've been studying different discussions about what kind of methods actually work for co-production and to create. So I'm really kind of convinced that from also the other literature that this is really important contribution. So I don't come from psychology, I come from STS. So my questions won't be on the methods and the effects that you measured, because to me, it sounds very convincing, everything that you represented. So I'm kind of, maybe my first question maybe would be whether you have some reflections on which of these, because you use different kind of approaches to this type of co-creation. So I'm more maybe interested whether you think certain methods work better in certain types of contexts or certain cases, or whether they're, because now it seems like what I have been reading is that we need a lot of different methods. We need to engage with these kind of developments at different stages. But do you have something more concrete that you could say maybe about the relationship between the different cases you presented?
Well, I would say the biggest advice would be to let the ones who will actually engage, like your target audience, they should be the ones who decide on the methods they want to use, depending on their culture and depending on how they are usually communicating. There are groups that communicate way more in, I don't know, visual ways, and some more in kind of bodily ways. And so we usually kind of asked our groups, like, what are usual ways of kind of being artistic or creative in your community, and then we picked up on that to design our study. And I think, I don't know, that was how we did it. I don't know if that is a very good way, but from the cluster analysis, what I can also say is, in the end, the actual format does not matter as much as the relevance for the group. So the relevance for the group is more important than the format itself.
Good. That's a good answer. And then I'm wondering, now you talked about groups, because in the introduction you said that this is an inclusive kind of method. So I'm wondering, like, for myself also from a practical point of view, how do you determine which groups to invite, and how do you determine that it is inclusive? How much does it rely on the types of groups that you invite to this types of engagement efforts, and how much does it depend on the method that you use?
Okay. So the inclusive part, for example, was usually the scenario development part, and like this whole project in which those 5 of those 6 studies were conducted in was a 4-year project. So this was a very quick and superficial run through, and what we didn't see was that there was around 2 years of planning, who to involve, and all these questions. So we had a very strong relationship and a tight contact with the local communities, and we were collaborating with a lot of sociologists who would figure out with us who does what in these communities. And we would talk, of course, also to community members, to our local partners, to in the end come up with some kind of inclusive design that really represents also the minorities, like immigrants or women groups, and to bring them all together in order to create these future scenarios together. And for those experimental designs that I just showed, it was also very often convenient sampling. Like when you're already on an island like Palawan with very limited electricity, then it's quite hard to also get a very I don't know, a variety of participants. So we sometimes went for student samples in our experiments. So yeah, it was a mix of very strong focus on inclusivity, but then sometimes when it came to the practicalities, we went for convenient samples in the end.
Thank you. And maybe the last kind of point or question I want to make, which might be kind of the kind of, I can't go without it, because you said that this kind of method is used for decision making. So you want to see to involve different groups in decision making. But everything I heard, because then I would think that it also affects some kind of concrete efforts for sustainable change, or what you said, kind of actual sustainable change. So what I understood now from the presentation is that you focus on the intentions. So it's actually the intentions that is the outcome then of these. But I'm still kind of struggling with knowing, I mean, of course, intentions are good, but it's never enough. So I'm always, I struggle with how this actually translates to concrete actions. Yes, if I understand you have a lot of time before the project to kind of develop the methods and create these relationships of trust, which I think is really important. But what happens after? Yeah.
So I think there are two answers to this. First of all, the intentions, the items that we used to measure the intentions were more concrete than just I want to change or something like that. It was specific items that are relevant for this village, for example, relating to plastic pollution or something like that. And depending on how high they score on those very specific items, we can see which actions might be the ones to kind of go to first, because they show the biggest change. So where are the people most willing to change? And then you can address those, for example. So at least we can make a decision based on those effects, which actions are most likely to be implemented, and then support them on this future pathway. And this project also involves like the psychology part of this project is like tiny. So we have a lot of natural science around it as well. And some of the big efforts are really directly feeding into policy making and into the natural sciences. And we are currently writing up a paper where we see also the change of the ecosystems, for example. So we are not only measuring the intentions, we are also measuring potential changes in the ecosystem and potential changes in the policy making. And so we can also look at it from a multidisciplinary perspective. So that might also kind of answer your questions. And of course, we wouldn't stop after those studies. We are still collaborating with those communities and trying to help them to implement some of the changes that they were talking about.
So how long is I'm just now, last thing, how long is the project? Because how do you sustain that kind of cooperation over time, which is very hard to do with such short projects? So
absolutely. Yeah, it's a 4-year project, and it ends next March. And we have kind of follow-on small grants to support the findings and the implementation. But as you say, it's very hard to kind of move forward with the same energy, because everyone then moves on to new projects. And so, yeah, I think that's a very big problem in research and sustainable development in general, that you have a limited amount of time, and then after that is over, then you basically leave again and you're like, so now implement what we said. And yeah.